Hi there, this is Solitary Ronan from Solitary Ronan Films, and welcome to another neglected gem. And today's neglected gem comes all the way from 1993, a Canadian film called 32 Short Films about Glenn Gould. Yes, this is DVD only, it's another film that needs a Blu-ray. This is the CD soundtrack, which if you're a fan of Bach, I would highly recommend. And there's a famous shot of Glenn Gould as played by Colm Feore. Never quite sure how to pronounce his name. This was written and directed by Francois Girard, who went on to do the Red Violin and the choir. Music's always an important part of his films. I think his last film in 2019 is about a young musical protege who goes missing in Europe. This film was co-written by Don McKellar, who's a Canadian actor who's worked with Atom Egoyan. He was the pet shop owner in Exotica, if you've seen Exotica by Atom Egoyan, in '95 I believe that was. So this is a biopic of Glenn Gould, who was a famous Canadian pianist who was famous for his interpretations of Bach. He died when he was 50 of a stroke in 1982. He was a bit of an eccentric, he was a bit of a loner, he was obsessed with musical perfection, he was obsessed with the music of language and conversation. When they sent Voyager probes 1 and 2 into space in 1977 with their mission to go beyond the edge of our galaxy, which I think they got there in 1987 or 1989 allegedly. There was recordings of Bach by Glenn Gould put into those probes to tell the aliens that we have good musical taste. He's an interesting character. Colm Feore gives a wonderfully focused, intense performance. But what makes 32 Short Films about Glenn Gould special to me is it's not your standard biopic. How many biopics have you seen where they just do this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened, and it's really quite dull and unengaging? Whereas this film, as you may have guessed, is made up of 32 short films. The running time is only about 95-96 minutes, so you can do the math for how long each film is. Obviously they're not spread equally, they're not made equally of equal length. So for example, there's one called 45 Seconds and a Chair, which is wonderful because it's literally with the soundtrack of Bach, just a slow pan in to Glenn Gould sitting in a chair. Sneakily, the film is actually in kind of chronological order. So the first episode, Lake Simcoe, is set in the cottage where he grew up, or spent some of his time growing up, and it's Glenn Gould as a child playing or listening to the piano being played by his mother. Music was in his life from an early age. Apparently when his mother was pregnant she played the piano, to give him a head start. So it is sneakily in chronological order, but the short films are random and again not what you would expect from a biopic, and that's what makes it wonderful. Now obviously if you're a fan of Bach, then it's an essential film to check out, and like I said, the soundtrack is pretty fantastic. It's 70 minutes long, so again I would highly recommend the soundtrack. So for example, how is it different? Well, the 32 short films. So again, it's how to not explain away a life or try and understand what made him tick, because he's obviously a pretty complicated fellow. But it's more to piece together what might have been going on between the ears. So we have interviews with friends, the documentary filmmaker, Yehudi Menuhin's interviewed, and then there's an interview with his cousin who spoke to him near his death. But there's random conversations with chambermaids and other things, again to try and get a portrait of his idiosyncrasies. There's other parts which are just pieces of music that he's recorded. There's a really wonderful one called CD 318, which is the piano that he had, and we just see the insides of the piano as he's playing a piece, so we get to see the strings and the chords and the hammers and the keys, the underside of the keys. And once the performance is finished, we just see the empty piano on the stage, and we see two removal guys cover the piano and wheel it off the stage. So we never actually see Glenn Gould performing. There's a film called the LA Concert, which was his last concert. He retired from live performance at the age of 31, died when he was 50, because he didn't appreciate the kind of live setting, because not everybody hears the same thing. Because again, he was into musical perfection, but then in some of his recordings he hums while he's performing, so again there's lots of contradictions going on. But the LA Concert is a wonderful one, because we just see him preparing, and then he talks to a stagehand before he goes on stage. So again, during the film we never actually see him play the piano, we just hear it. There's some other ones where he has an interview with himself, so there's two Glenn Goulds talking, and this was actually written by Glenn Gould, an interview with himself. Yes, he was, you can kind of tell he was a bit of an egomaniac, and he was into solitude and isolation. You know, there's another wonderful little film called Questions with No Answers, which is just a series of journalists asking him things on the phone, because he preferred phone interviews rather than personal interviews. You know, there's questions about his sexuality, because he was never married and never, because again it was almost like he wasn't interested in that kind of thing, because it got in the way of focusing on the music. There's a little wonderfully funny one called The Tip, which is about the stock market, because he did some business on there. You know, when he died, he left half of his estate to the SPCA for the prevention of cruelty to animals, and half to the Salvation Army. He did radio programs about various things, basically about solitude. So there's one called The Idea of North. The film opens and closes with almost the Omar Sharif entrance from Lawrence of Arabia, but instead of a desert, it's an icy wasteland, and he kind of walks towards the camera, and then also at the end of the film he walks away from the camera. There's a really nice couple of ones. There's one called Pills, where Glenn Gould is listing all the drugs that he's taking, prescription drugs, not illegal drugs, and their side effects, and it's literally just images of pills and the side effects. And again, that's followed up by a friend of his talking about going into his bathroom one day and just having a rack of all these pills, and she asks him whether he's taking all of these, and he's like, no, it's okay, I'm not taking them all at the one time. He was a bit of a hypochondriac. He was always had gloves and scarves and hats on because he was paranoid about drafts and getting the cold. He was a complicated fellow by all accounts. But again, so you're getting fragments of a life that at the end of the film you kind of get to know him a little bit better. There's actually moments that are quite moving, but more of that is the people that knew him and how his loss affected them. I mean, I would say by the end of the film he's still a little bit impenetrable as far as, you know, it doesn't explain away. You can't explain an artist, or if you want to say he was a genius, you can't explain away that in an hour and a half. But I feel that this film does a pretty good job of at least giving us an idea of what he's like, compared with, like I say, the bog standard dull as dishwater biopic of in 1942 this happened, and in 1944 this happened, in 1950 this happened. There's a couple of films that are animation. So Girard really just plays with the form. You know, like I said, there's animation, there's just pieces of music, there's just objects. There's Gould in the recording studio while the board technicians are doing playback. He's getting into the music and he's playing it in his head. But again, another really nice detail about the film is you never actually see him playing the piano. There's a lovely episode called Hamburg, where again he would go to hotels and stay in there for like 18 months, and he gets a delivery, and he asks the chambermaid who's there to sit down and stay in the room, which obviously at first she's a little bit suspicious of, but he takes out a record and puts it on, and it's one of his new releases of the recording, and how that affects the chambermaid is actually quite moving. Again, it's one of those things, if you don't like a short film, you only have to wait a couple of minutes and there's another one coming, because there's 32 of them. I should say the end titles, I think, count as a short film. So what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say this is a neglected gem. I think it's one of the best films of the 90s. It's a film that deserves more exposure, as much as films deserve more exposure. It's a film that certainly deserves a Blu-ray. It's a film with a wonderful soundtrack. Again, you can pick up the soundtrack for £2 or £3 sterling on eBay, for example. The film itself is probably harder to pick up or more expensive to pick up than the actual soundtrack is. But it's just a perfect example of taking something that can be fairly banal as a biopic and using all the tools of cinema, all the techniques, chopping it up, and still making a wonderful film that at least tries to understand how an artist works, or tries to understand some kind of motivation for an artist. Plus he gets sent into space, which is quite an achievement. There's a few people that quite like to fly into space, but his work actually gets sent into space. So somewhere there might be an alien listening to Glenn Gould's interpretation of Bach. So if you're a fan of biopics, I would certainly check it out. If you're a fan of Glenn Gould, then obviously I would check it out. And if you're a fan of Bach, It's actually quite a nice companion piece to The Silence Before Bach, which was released on second run by Per Portabella. I did a double take video on these two films. So 32 short films with Glenn Gould's actually quite a nice double bill with The Silence Before Bach. And on that Bach-shaped bombshell, I will say thanks very much for watching. Please let me know in the comments below if you've seen 32 short films about Glenn Gould. And if you like, you can rank them in order of your favourite short films about Glenn Gould, 1 to 32. Or send your answers in a postcard. So this is Soldier Ronan from Soldier Ronan Films, saying thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you'll join me again for more neglected gems. And I'll say cheerio.